All right, now South Africa has an 85% chance of being greylisted. A report commissioned by Business Leadership South Africa finds that the greylisting is highly likely when the Financial Action Task Force meets in February next year. The report estimates that the impact will be under 1% of GDP if government acts with urgency. For more on this, let's speak to BLSA CEO Busi Mavuso, who joins us now virtually. Thank you very much for speaking to us, and good morning to you. Of course, as South Africans, we're really hoping that we do not make it on this list, but you're saying 85% chance. Why? What made you come to that finding?
Thank you very much, Masejo, and thanks for inviting me. So there is a high likelihood, and I must say that National Treasury is really seized with trying to see if we can avert a downgrade, or at least if the impact of it will not be as dire. So FATF normally assesses countries against 40 recommendations, which is the technical compliance, as well as 11 immediate outcomes, which is the effective assessment. Out of the 40 recommendations, which is the technical compliance, South Africa only met 20. And out of the effectiveness assessment of the 11 immediate outcomes, we didn't comply with any of those. And we were therefore given 12 priority actions by FATF to put in place after they assessed us in 2019. And out of the 12, it seems as if we have only implemented 2 as a country. So we are not compliant with 10. And when you look at what the 10 are, you will see, Masaho, that there is a lot that we actually have to do, and it's not things that can be done overnight. Because the main concern of FATF is that, number one, we experienced the state capture project as a country for 10 years, and we failed to detect it, and we failed to do anything about it. We have failed to prosecute anyone for the state capture project. As we sit now, as we speak now, no one has actually been dragged to jail as a result of the state capture project. And their concern, therefore, is that it is clear that South Africa doesn't have a tight enough control environment to can detect these things. Even when it is being detected, it means that we are not in a position to deal with it. So we are therefore seen as a weak link in the world of one of the countries where money laundering can be easy to actually do. And it means that if any of the countries in the world want to do money laundering, South Africa can be seen as that destination which can actually facilitate money laundering because of our weak control environment. So we therefore have to implement some of those actions. Some of the things that they raised, for instance, was that the hawks have to be provided with more staff, especially financial investigators and forensic accountants, to better pursue money laundering. Some of the things that one of the other things that they raised is that we have to implement a cash declaration system at our borders to ensure that we can actually detect and seize illicit cash flows. So these are some of the things that are currently not in place. A person can walk in with money from one country into South Africa, and we don't have systems that can actually detect and seize those illicit cash flows. So these are all interventions that we actually have to put in place, as well as building policies that can ensure that there is clear supervision, of money laundering in South Africa, and that is not currently in place. So the NPA is doing a lot to make sure that people can actually be prosecuted for the state capture project. National Treasury has been coordinating the efforts of government to ensure that we can actually bring a report to FATF that can enable us to actually avert being greylisted as a country. But all of that is work in progress, and the deadline is October. And we are just worried that looking at how much it's going to require, for us to implement these things, we might just not make it as a country.
Yeah, and that's my worry as well, because, the timeline, you're saying since 2019, we don't have much time now. There's different deadlines, of course. There's one also in April. And now that you're saying 85%, and our first one already is in October, I want to go back to the point that you made about, the state capture issue in South Africa and the fact that it took us long to detect it. Is it not going to make any difference at all what the NPA and your SIU have done so far in implementing some of the recommendations by the Commission?
You know, that is what we're actually hoping. And we had this conversation with Shamila as the business community, I think about 2 days ago, where she was talking about the progress that has been made to capacitate the NPA.
Yeah.
You know, and I think one of the biggest issues for FATF, when they actually assessed us in 2019, they were saying that we have a very weak criminal justice system. But remember, Maseko, that was intentional. You know, the intention of the state capture project was to precisely weaken the criminal justice system so that the corruption that they actually undertook, you know, over the 10 years during that time, you know, could actually be, you know. So I think the weakening of these institutions was one of the biggest things that actually made FATF to actually sit up and listen and actually place or give these priority actions for South Africa to actually implement. So there has been work that has been done, you know. Shamila in particular from the NPA's perspective has done a lot, you know, to try and ensure that we can actually effectively capacitate the NPA. You know, when you look at what SARS has done as well, when you look at what the Department of Justice has done, when you look at what the South African Reserve Bank has done, you know, there are big positives, you know, and collaboration that has actually been done to implement, you know, some of the interventions. But, you know, there is a lot that we still need to do. And I think we're just worried from that perspective that we may not be able to make the cut. And I think more worrying, Maseko, is the economic impact that this will have, you know, on the South African
absolutely, absolutely, which is already in tatters at the moment. Now tell me, in terms of the fact that, for instance, we have this fractured criminal justice system, right, etc., which is taking place. But remember, Mauritius also went through something like this, and they were greylisted, and then I think the timeline for them to get off that grey list, it took them just about 20 months to come off the grey list. But of course, we want to avoid even getting onto it, right? Because we don't know if we'll be as strong as Mauritius to get out of it. So what do we do? What kind of lessons do we have to take from what happened to Mauritius and implement them here, besides the stuff that FATF has told us to do?
So you're actually right, you know, to say that it took Mauritius that amount of time, but it's because there was a concerted effort, you know, that they put in place, and there was political will to make sure that they actually incessantly communicated, even after they were grey listed, you know, with the authorities of what progress that they've actually made so far to ensure that they get out, you know, of the grey listing, or rather to implement the recommendations that they were actually given by FATF. You know, so what we have to do in the South African case, you know, we have been, National Treasury has really been a star, you know, over the past few months to try and really coordinate the efforts of government to ensure that we can meet some of these deadlines, and I'm hoping that they are going to be successful. So even when we are grey listed in February, we need to constantly communicate. But the momentum as well, Maseko, you know, the way we are working so hard at the moment to avert the downgrade, when we are, if we do get downgraded in February, let's continue on the same momentum so that we can make sure that we implement, you know, the recommendations that have been given by FATF. And the important one is also building the institutional capacity, because remember, the biggest issue is that you don't have the institutional capacity to can detect these things. You don't have the processes to can detect these things. You don't have the systems that are sophisticated enough.
I mean, that takes me back to the July unrest and, you know, state security and where it was.
Precisely. You know, so we really have to build institutional capacity. There has to be an internal task team that is set up in the presidency to lead the government response to grey listing, working with the interdepartmental committee. You know, companies already have to prepare themselves, and the banking institutions and the banking industry is already doing that to communicate with their foreign counterparts, you know, around the possibility of being grey listed, to see, you know, what that enhanced due diligence is going to be, that is actually going to be required. Mauritius did exactly that. They actually put everything aside, Maseko, and focused on getting themselves, you know, from the grey listing. That is why it only took them 20 months. But the biggest concern as well is that, you know, we are a big trading partner with the EU and the UK. And as soon as we get grey listed, Maseko, the EU and the UK will have no choice but to immediately impose a higher risk category recovery, on South African counterparts, which might impact investment flows.
Yeah.
And you remember we're trying to get investment as a country so that we can be able to grow our economy. So I think that is the biggest concern that we have, that our investment efforts can be impacted, because we are going to be seen as this high-risk country, because our country risk is definitely going to be, affected, which means that our currency will be affected, which means that interest rates are going to be high. It just makes a bad situation worse, as you have said.
Yeah, and there's going to have to be a lot more begging that the politicians will have to do then to try and keep the investors here, which we are already begging because of how our country looks already and the many downgrades that we've seen economically here. Before I let you go, Ma'am Mavuso, I have to ask you this, and although I know you're no longer a member of the Eskom board, I just have to ask you, especially when it comes to greylisting and the energy crisis that we face in South Africa, that translates into a very bad economic crisis as well. And, Eskom's contribution as well to state capture, etc., is immense. Was there any political will during your time there to fix what's happening there? To us as South Africans, we're very despondent. It looks like nothing was done to try and fix what was happening at Eskom.
I think you saw the president's announcement around the electricity crisis plan that we have to put in place as a country. And I think that is about 2 months ago. And if you look at that plan, it is bringing the private sector capacity. Remember, government has been pushing back against bringing in the private sector to try and assist some of these institutions. And I think when you see what's happening at Transnet as well, the president has announced as well before, that there's going to be the private sector participation to the tune of 100 billion rands, and these SOEs, after being ravaged by the state capture project, the reality is that they cannot stand on their own 2 feet. The systems, the processes, the capacity, that they need for them to go back to where they used to be resides in the private sector. So you're seeing the private sector generation capacity actually being brought into Eskom on a much more larger scale, which will enable us to have the energy stability that we require. You and I were talking about investment at the moment. If we want to try and get investment into the country, these are the things that are actually going to strengthen the business case for South Africa, because it's difficult to try and get investors in the country if your ports are not working, if your rail is not working, if your water infrastructure is not what it should be, if your road infrastructure is not what it should be, if your energy is not working, right? So these are all the issues, from a networking industry's perspective, these are all the issues that we're actually trying to address. And you are seeing pockets of efforts that are actually coming through to try and ensure that we can get the situation right, especially for investment business.
Yeah, I just have to ask you this very quickly. You seem quite positive in the plan that the president announced, but you still resigned as a member. So where is your hope when it comes to Eskom? Just tell us, should we be hopeful as South Africans?
Remember, the plan that we actually that was announced by the president came from Eskom. It came from Eskom and it went to the presidency. And to the presidency, it was then, discussed among the many government entities and the departments that are actually involved, in Eskom, DMRE and all the other ones, DPE and everyone else who has to do with Eskom. So it was therefore accepted from that perspective. And the reason, why private sector participation was suggested by Eskom in the first place, Andre is on record on having spoken about these things many times, to say that the current generation capacity of Eskom is not in a position to provide the energy security that we need as a country. And to fix it, it's going to take a very long time, because this is damage that has actually been done, over the past 15 years. So it's not going to be an overnight fix. And I think we're naive as a country to think that the damage of the state capture project that took place for more than 10 years can be fixed in 3 years. It won't be fixed in 3, it won't be fixed in 5. It will take a long time. So that is why, therefore, the private sector generation that is being brought in, it is brought in to actually complement what Eskom is currently doing. I don't think we have ever brought in private sector generation capacity to this scale as a country. So government allowing the private sector to come in is an acknowledgement of the fact that we do need the help and we do need interventions from all perspectives.